Heavy darkness surrounds everything. Somewhere in the distance, cries and screams of people can be heard. Suddenly, a cold wind blows. She realizes she is lying in a trench, surrounded by countless lifeless bodies. There are even a few bodies lying on top of her, making it difficult for her to breathe. With one hand, she pushes the bodies off to the side. Blood from a wound on her head flows into her eyes and nose, wiping the blood from her eyes. She glances around. The moonlight is faint, and searchlights sweep across the area. Perhaps they thought she was dead. Suddenly, she hears two men speaking behind her. Two soldiers have entered the trench. Their goal is to find anyone still alive and shoot them. They might discover her. Her mind races. Taking a deep breath, she closes her eyes and lies completely still like a corpse. Moments later, she hears the sound of a single gunshot, silencing a person who is groaning and crying nearby. She knows her turn will come soon. Welcome to a End Milestones. It's September 29, 8 a.m. The city is bustling with activity. Near Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, lies Dina's home. Dina is an actress at the Kyiv Puppet Theater. She is a Jewish woman married to Victor. Victor is an Orthodox Christian of Russian-Ukrainian descent. They have 2 children, 1 boy and 1 girl. After leaving her children in Victor's care, Dina hurriedly prepares to leave the house. The reason for her haste is a notice that appeared in the newspapers and on the streets that morning. The German army has surrounded or perhaps already taken control of Kyiv. The notice reads, "On September 29 at 8 a.m., all Jewish families residing in Kyiv and its surrounding areas must gather at the designated street. You are being relocated. Carry all necessary belongings with you. Failure to comply will result in German soldiers visiting your home directly, as the city registry contains records of all Jewish residents and their addresses. If we find anyone who disobeys this order, they will face death. All Jewish families must assemble at the specified street without fail." This notice has plunged Jewish families into fear and panic. The rumor is that Jews are being relocated by the Germans to some other place. Failing to comply would mean soldiers storming into their homes within hours. In terror, entire families, elderly, sick women, and children gathered their belongings and began heading toward the designated street. For Dina, there's another reason for her urgency. Her parents and younger sister live in another part of the city. Dina hopes to see them one last time, carrying her documents, which she believes can prove she is not Jewish. She sets out into the city. The papers do not explicitly identify her as Jewish, and she hopes to show them to a German officer and escape. As she walks, Dina sees familiar faces, her relatives and friends walking the same path with fear etched on their faces. Everyone seems unsure of what awaits them. Small children hold tightly to their parents' hands as the crowd slowly moves into the city. Upon entering the city, Dina is met with a horrifying sight. Thousands of Jewish families wander aimlessly, unsure of their destination. Their faces reflect a grim realization that they might never return. For a moment, Dina imagines her children holding her hands, but she quickly remembers they are safe with Victor. The Jewish families are now herded like sheep toward a large Jewish cemetery. The Germans have erected a tall fence around it, fortified with tanks pointing their guns directly at the crowd. German soldiers in uniform line the area, dividing the people into groups. Families are separated, parents in one line, children in another. Those who resist are beaten brutally. Dina's parents and younger sister are placed in a separate line. Helpless, Dina is forced into another line. As the Germans push her forward, she notices a soldier removing a blanket she was using to cover herself. A cold wind chills her to the bone. A tall, imposing German soldier approaches her and whispers in her ear, "If you spend the night with me, I'll ensure your safety, Dinah." Recalling similar offers she received in the past as an actress, looks at him disdainfully. But as he walks away, she realizes her mistake. Accepting his offer might have been her only chance to survive. She turns to find him, but he has disappeared into the crowd. Suddenly, she hears a voice behind her. Turning around, she sees an elderly man who has been separated from his family. The frail man asks for her help without hesitation. Dinah grabs his hands and asks, "Grandfather, where are they taking us?" The old man replies, "My child, I may be blind, but I can sense what's happening around me. This is the sound of death." As the crowd surges forward, the old man and Dinah are pushed to the ground, struggling to get up. In front, 2 rows of soldiers were standing. They were stripping the people passing through. Their goal was to humiliate them before killing them. In the meantime, a Jew who tried to escape was torn apart by the soldiers. Dogs, men, women, and children were all stripped. The soldiers laughed and mocked the women who tried to cover themselves with their hands out of shame. Seeing this, Dinah realized one thing: everything was out of her control. Now, how would she convince anyone that she was married to a Ukrainian citizen? She began trembling in fear, wondering what she would do next or where she would go. She wanted to see her children and husband. She felt she should never have come here. But now, it seemed impossible to go back. She couldn't find a way to escape. Suddenly, from amidst the crowd, she heard a familiar voice shout, "Dinah, you're not a Jewish woman anymore, so don't stay here. Escape immediately." This was what she heard. When she turned to look, she saw her mother, father, and sister were all standing there, stripped naked. Her parents were drenched in blood. It was her mother who told her not to stay there. 2 soldiers were trampling her younger sister on the ground, tearing off the last piece of cloth from her body. Dinah was so terrified that she could hardly breathe. Her mother was lying on the ground, screaming for her to leave. Dinah suddenly thought of her children. Even after seeing such a horrific sight, she realized she couldn't save them, and she wept like a machine. She turned and walked away. The first officer she saw was a Ukrainian soldier who had sided with the Germans. She told him that she had ended up there by mistake with a group of workers. "I'm not a Jewish woman, I'm Ukrainian," she said. "So please let me go." The officer asked her to show her papers. Dinah took out the documents she had kept with her and showed them to him. The documents didn't mention anywhere that she was Jewish. The officer said, "Go and sit by that small mound over there. There are some others like you, Ukrainians and Russians, who ended up here by mistake. Once we're done killing these Jews by evening, we'll let you all leave." Hearing this, Dinah was horrified, but she didn't show it. She knew she would never see her father, mother, or sister alive again. With a heavy heart, she went to the mound and sat there. She didn't lift her head for hours. In the meantime, the horrifying process of beating and stripping the people continued. Occasionally, when she lifted her head, she saw some people lying on the ground laughing hysterically. Having lost their sanity, the German soldiers were laughing without restraint at this sight. In another corner, they were snatching children from their mothers. Dinah lowered her head when she saw them throwing some children over the wall into a pit beyond. At the same time, the Germans divided the stripped people into groups of 3 or 4 and sent them beyond the wall into another area. No one who went into that area ever came back by evening. She saw her father, mother, and sister being led beyond the wall. A cold wind blew, and just before it got dark, a large car arrived at the field. A high-ranking German officer stepped out. Dinah overheard him telling the soldiers, "Don't bother counting. Kill every Jew who came here." When another officer asked what to do with the Ukrainians sitting by the mound, the officer replied, "To ensure that the outside world doesn't learn about what we did here. They can't be allowed to leave either." Hearing this, Dina was paralyzed with fear. The German soldiers took all the remaining Jews to the other side of the wall. None of them resisted. They moved like lifeless puppets. Dina realized that in the face of certain death, all humans might act the same. Next, it was the turn of the group sitting by the mound, which included Dina. There were 10 of them in total. None of them looked around or spoke a word. Like lifeless puppets, they followed the German soldiers. By then, it was already dark. Perhaps because of the darkness, their clothes were not removed. The only aim was to take them straight to execution. Slowly, they walked to the place beyond the wall where no one returned. Dina noticed German soldiers sitting around the pit, some warming themselves by fires, others chatting. Their loud laughter echoed through the night, like sheep being led to slaughter. Dina's group reached the pit. She saw that in front of them. The group ahead was lined up at the edge of the pit, facing the soldiers. Behind them, a massive trench lay open. Suddenly, the soldiers opened fire, and Dina saw blood spray everywhere as the people fell screaming into the pit. Dina's group was next. Without a word, they moved mechanically to the same edge of the pit, facing the soldiers. As she walked, Dina saw bodies piled up below, illuminated by the moonlight, standing at the edge of the pit. She felt the ground give way beneath her. Suddenly, the sound of machine guns erupted. At that moment, Dina's mind worked. She jumped into the pit before being hit, landing hard on a rock. She felt her face was injured, but there was no pain. Blood flowed from her head, soaking her face. She realized she was lying among hundreds of dead bodies. She wasn't shot. She had jumped before the bullets could hit her. As she lay there motionless, 2 more bodies fell on her. She slowly pushed them aside without making a sound. She didn't dare move, as she feared being seen by the soldiers above. A few moments later, she heard the sound of plates and utensils clanging. She realized the soldiers had paused for a meal. Cries and wails came from within the pit. Many who had not died from the gunfire were still alive, but none of them would see the morning, Dina thought. Only she had the fortune to fall into the pit unharmed. Blood from her head flowed into her eyes and nose, blinding her. Suddenly, searchlights swept across the pit. She understood that the soldiers were checking for anyone alive in the trench. She heard footsteps approaching. 2 soldiers had climbed into the pit to finish off any survivors. Dina took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and lay still. She hoped they would think she was dead. Moments later, the soldiers noticed someone groaning and shot them without hesitation. Then they approached Dina. She remained motionless, holding her breath. One of the soldiers inspected her body and said, "This one's dead. She was shot in the head." To ensure, he stepped on her chest and arm with his boots, crushing her flesh. Dina didn't flinch. Then the soldier struck her head lightly with the butt of his gun and declared her dead. The soldiers left the pit. Dina waited until the sounds of their footsteps faded. Taking a deep breath, she slowly got up. Just as she tried to stand, earth and stones fell over her. The Germans had begun filling the pit. Thankfully, they didn't finish the task properly that night. When the soldiers left, Dina carefully removed the soil covering her face and looked around. In the faint moonlight, she saw roots and vines hanging down from one side of the trench. She realized this was her way out. She quickly made her way to the edge, grabbed hold of a vine, and began climbing. Just as she was about to reach the top, she heard a voice behind her. "Auntie?" Terrified, she turned to see a boy about 10 years old, calling out to her from the darkness. "Can you take me with you?" he asked. "I am afraid of the dark." The truth is, that child's parents must have been shot and killed, just like Dina escaped. This boy must have fallen into this pit without being shot. Understanding the situation, Dina told him. "Follow me," without making a sound. The boy joined her, and both of them climbed the roots and vines without making any noise and reached the top of the trench. So much had happened in the trench in one night. Now, dawn was breaking. If they stayed on top of the trench any longer, they might be discovered. They needed to hide somewhere. They spotted a place nearby full of bushes, and they quickly ran there and hid among the thickets. As the day brightened, German soldiers returned and started covering the trench. It was a large trench, so they couldn't cover it completely, but they managed to pile enough soil to hide the bodies. By afternoon, most of the bodies were covered with soil. Dina and the boy watched this silently from their hiding spot in the thickets, completely exhausted. Dina collapsed unconscious within the thickets. When she regained consciousness hours later, she saw the boy sitting nearby, crying. He thought Dina had died. As the day passed and night began to fall, they saw a forest nearby to stand a chance of survival. They needed to reach that forest. As darkness started to descend, they carefully crawled through the thickets. Unfortunately, their movement was noticed by the German soldiers. A gunshot rang out. Hearing the sound, they dropped to the ground, knowing it was safer to remain still. After some time, Dina raised her head and saw that no one was approaching. She then nudged the boy lying next to her, but he didn't move. The bullet had hit the boy. It struck the back of his head, and he had been dead for hours. Dina spent the entire night weeping next to the boy's body. By morning, she was so weak that she fell asleep again. When she woke up, it was already nightfall. Realizing it was pointless to stay there, she left the boy behind and crawled away, aiming for the forest they had seen earlier. Somehow, she made her way into the forest without being noticed. Moving further inside, she saw a faint light in the distance. Looking closely, she realized it was a hut. The light was coming from its window. Hoping for help, she approached cautiously. As she neared the hut, two dogs came barking and leaping out, terrifying her. Dina had no strength left to run. At that moment, a farmer's wife came out of the hut, scolded the dogs, and drove them away. Dina, trembling with fear, told the woman, "I am a Ukrainian. I got trapped here accidentally. Please take me to my husband." The woman understood and reassured Dina, saying, "Don't worry, you'll be safe here. I will send my eldest son to help you." Shortly after, the woman's son came out. She instructed him, and he disappeared into the forest. A while later, he returned with a German soldier. Pointing to Dina, he said, "Here is a Jewish woman." The soldier immediately struck Dina, and she fell to the ground, but they didn't let her remain there. The soldier lifted her up and took her to another place. When Dina looked around, she realized she had been brought back to the same place from where her journey had begun, the site where people were stripped and killed. Another woman who had escaped like Din was also there. Her name was Lyobi. The two women spent the entire night sitting in one spot. They were too weak to move and were given no food or water. By morning, a truck arrived, and they were loaded into its back along with a few others. Din and Lyobi understood that they were not going to be killed here, because the trenches had already been filled. The plan was to take them elsewhere. The truck began its journey, with two soldiers in the front. During the journey, Dina whispered to Lyobi, "We must escape somehow. When the truck slows down, we will jump off and run. There are no soldiers in the back to catch us, and those in the front won't notice because of the bumpy road." Both agreed silently. When the truck entered a dense forest, Dina gave a signal. 1, T2, T3. Both women jumped off the truck, although they fell hard. Their will to survive helped them get up and run, unknowingly. They ran in different directions. Dina was fortunate. She ended up in a camp of Russian soldiers fighting against the Germans. Thus, she survived one of the largest massacres of World War II, the Babi Yar massacre. Over 33,771 Jews were killed by the Germans in that massacre over the course of one day and night. Evidence shows that Din was one of about 29 people who escaped. The massive trenches where the bodies were buried were later discovered, and the remains were examined after the war. However, only a few identities could be confirmed. The rest remain unknown. Years later, Dina testified against the German soldiers in a war crimes trial in Kyiv. She reunited with her 2 children, who were found in an orphanage in 1944 after a long search. However, her husband, Victor, was taken by German soldiers during the war and executed for reasons unknown. Dina spent the rest of her life in Ukraine as an actress, sharing her experiences in various places. Her stories were later turned into books. Dina passed away in 1977 at the age of 65.